Good afternoon, and welcome to the White House webinar entitled Building Community Preparedness to Extreme Heat. My name is George Luber, and I'm the Chief of the Climate and Health Program at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, where we are busy preparing the nation's public health infrastructure for the health challenges of climate change. It's my pleasure to serve as your moderator today. One of our principal health concerns of climate change is the impact that extreme heat events will have on public health. Because climate change is not only leading to a rise in global average temperatures, but also a rise in the frequency and magnitude of extreme heat events. Extreme heat events occur when temperatures are substantially higher than average for a particular location at a given time of year, and they are the leading weather-related cause of mortality in the United States. In fact, a recent report from the U.S. Global Change Research Program stated that by the end of the century, we can expect an increase of thousands to tens of thousands of premature heat-related deaths each summer, based on present-day sensitivity. Fortunately, the majority of heat-related deaths and illnesses are preventable. By taking action to prepare for and respond to extreme heat events, we can dramatically reduce the risks associated with extreme heat, especially for the most vulnerable populations. These include the elderly and the very young, people with certain health conditions, people like farmers or construction workers who work outside. Which brings us to the purpose of today's webinar, to increase community preparedness to extreme heat events. Shortly, you will hear from a panel of experts speaking about the growing risks of extreme heat and strategies that can be taken to reduce health effects, with a focus on protecting the most vulnerable populations. Today's event is also part of the Federal Emergency Management Agency's annual PrepareAthon, who has designated this week as Extreme Heat Week. In addition to this webinar, this week's events include the launch of the National Integrated Heat Health Information System, developed by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. This new interagency web portal, found at climate.gov/NIHHIS, integrates heat health information, case studies, and tools from across the federal government to support on-the-ground efforts to reduce heat-related impacts on human health. Before I introduce our first speaker, I'd like to take a moment to thank my federal colleagues and members of the Planning Committee for their tremendous effort to make this event happen. Special thanks to Steph Morrison at the White House for her leadership on this effort. I'm honored today to introduce our first speaker, one of my science heroes and champion of climate change science and action, Dr. John Holdren. Dr. Holdren is President Obama's Science and Technology Advisor and the Senate-confirmed Director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. Trained in aerospace engineering and theoretical plasma physics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and Stanford University, he spent most of his career as a faculty member at the University of California, Berkeley, and Harvard, leading interdisciplinary programs focused on energy technology and policy, global environmental change, nuclear arms control, and non-proliferation, and science and technology policy. He is a member of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, the U.S. National Academy of Engineering, the American Philosophical Society, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He is also a foreign member of both the Royal Society of London and the Indian National Academy of Engineering, and a former president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Dr. Holdren, it's truly a pleasure to have you on today's webinar. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you very much. So the question is, can people see my slides? Let me go back to the title slide. Is this working?
It's not. It's in double mode.
Okay, 1 second.
Oh, why don't you go?
How about that?
What about that?
Perfect.
We're good.
Okay. So I'm going to talk for just a few minutes about the science of the growing risk from extreme heat under global climate change. And I start with the overarching science context, basically what we know about climate change as a whole. And we know beyond reasonable doubt from an immense body of climate science, basically 5 crucial things. The climate of the Earth is changing at a pace and in a pattern that is not explainable by natural influences. We know what does explain it. fossil fuel burning and land use change, emitting carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. We know as well that those changes are already causing harm to life, health, property, economies, and ecosystems. We know that that harm will continue to grow for decades, both because of the momentum in the climate system and the inertia in society's energy system. But we also know, and this is very important, that the projected harm will be much smaller if we take prompt, strong, evasive action, both mitigation and adaptation, than if we don't. It's important to recognize that notwithstanding some of the claims of climate contrarians to the contrary, each decade since the 50s has been warmer than the last, and that includes very conspicuously our current decade, 6 years in. But of course, the warming is not uniformly distributed. The oceans are not warming as much as a general matter as the land masses, and the land masses are warming more in mid-continent and to the far north. Very important for the topic at hand, extreme heat, is that small increases in the average temperature lead to big increases in extremely hot weather. And you see that illustrated here. If you have what is called a normal distribution of temperatures in a given month or a given year, looks like the line here that is labeled current climate. If you slide that just a little bit to the right, the average temperature goes up a degree or two. You see what happens on the far right. You get a big increase in hot weather and an even bigger multiplication of the incidence of extreme hot weather. And in fact, observations bear that out. This rather complicated slide is worth the effort to understand it. I assume these slides will be available and you can go back and study it at your leisure. But what this shows is the normal distribution for summer temperatures in the northern hemisphere around the period 1951 to 1980. And that's the black line, and a red line that fits it rather well. A perfect normal distribution is the black line. Red line is what was actually experienced from 1951 to 61. And what you see as the successive decades move that distribution to the right, if you look out 3 standard deviations, that is a summer that is 3 standard deviations warmer than normal. That means a summer that would only occur once in 670 years under the baseline climate. That's what a 3 standard deviation warm summer means. And that has become vastly more probable under what actually happened between the 50s and the 2000s. One sees that where the 3 sigma extremely hot summers were vanishingly small in the baseline, they are a significant occurrence around 10% of the time in the climate of the 2000s. South Asia this month has provided a sobering example of what this means. The previous slide was for the whole landmass of the northern hemisphere. In India, earlier this month, as shown in this slide, a record temperature was set nearly 124 degrees Fahrenheit, 51 degrees Celsius in the shade. And of course, extremes of heat are not just about temperature. Humidity combines with temperature to create discomfort and danger. This is a NOAA slide, National Weather Service slide, showing how temperature and humidity combine to generate various dangers of concern, danger, and extreme danger in the red associated with that combination of temperature and humidity. The highest heat index values ever recorded happened in 2003 and in 2015. That's not by accident. The world is getting warmer. It's getting more humid at the same time. And so the heat index is going up even more rapidly than temperature alone. 9 of the 10 deadliest heat waves on record have occurred since 1980, 6 of those since 2000. And of course, we know that extreme heat is a special hazard for children, the elderly, and the disadvantaged. It turns out that working outdoors becomes inefficient, then impossible, as heat and humidity increase. This slide is based on something called the wet bulb global temperature. It's related to the heat index. It includes both humidity and temperature, but it also includes cloudiness, windiness, and direct exposure to sunlight. The values are shown at the bottom in both degrees Celsius and degrees Fahrenheit. And what you see is the capacity to do work, depending on how hard you have to work, 200 watts being a moderate level of work, 500 watts being a high level of work. Your ability to work declines in terms of percentage of your ordinary capacity, and it goes to zero at heat indices that are now being widely encountered, values of the wet globe bulb temperature being widely encountered around the world. And in fact, at the very high values, working outdoors is not merely impossible, it is fatal. Looking forward, case of Europe, one of those 6 strongest, most deadly heat waves in history occurred in Europe in 2003, killed in excess of 35,000 people in France, Spain, and Italy. You can see on the chart that at the time it occurred, it was an outlier. It was an unusual event, perhaps a 1 in 100 year event at the time. And yet, under medium growth scenarios, that is medium growth of emissions in the mid-range of future emission scenarios, that becomes a normal year by 2040 and an unusually cool year by 2070. This is very striking and, of course, very frightening. For the United States, if you look at what's happening going forward, again, this is for a medium emission scenario, and it looks at the percentage of summers during 2035 to 2064 that will be hotter than the 95th percentile summer in the period 50 to 79. And you see for much of the country, it's 100%. Every summer will be hotter than the hottest 5% of summers in the mid-20th century. The policy questions that arise, of course, surround the paramount issue: what should we do? And there are only 3 options. Mitigation, meaning measures we take to reduce the pace and magnitude of the changes in global climate caused by human activities. Adaptation, meaning measures to reduce, through building preparedness and resilience, the adverse impacts on human well-being resulting from the changes in climate that do occur. And the third option, of course, is suffering. Suffering the adverse impacts and societal disruption that we do not manage to avoid by either mitigation or adaptation. Concerning those 3 options, we're already doing some of each. We're doing some mitigation, we're doing some adaptation, preparedness, and resilience. What's up for grabs is the future mix of these 3, and obviously minimizing the amount of suffering in the mix can only be achieved by doing a lot of mitigation and a lot of adaptation. Mitigation alone doesn't work because climate change is already occurring and can't be stopped quickly. Adaptation alone doesn't work because adaptation gets costlier and less effective the larger are the changes in climate with which you're trying to cope. And as a result, clearly, we need enough mitigation to avoid unmanageable climate change and enough adaptation to manage the unavoidable climate change. What does adaptation for extreme heat look like? That's the focus of the rest of this White House webinar. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Holdren. We really appreciate your time and dedication to this issue. We will now transition to the panel portion of this webinar with our group of distinguished speakers presenting on various strategies to address community preparedness to extreme heat. Our first speaker, Dr. Doug Casa, will speak on preparing athletes, coaches, and parents. Dr. Casa is a full professor at the University of Connecticut and is the CEO of the Corey Stringer Institute. Corey was an offensive tackle for the Minnesota Vikings who died from exertional heat stroke in August 2001. The Corey Stringer Institute works towards preventing heat-related sudden death in sports through education, advocacy, public policy, research, media outreach, and publications. Dr. Casa has published more than 175 peer-reviewed publications related to exertional heat stroke, heat-related illness, preventing sudden death in sports, and hydration. Dr. Casa has successfully treated 215 cases of exertional heat stroke. Dr. Casa, it's a pleasure to have you on the webinar today.
Oh, it's an honor to be here. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I want to just take the time that I have to try to give a little bit of an overview of some of the most basic things we can do to prevent heat illnesses, especially heat stroke, from happening within the confines of sport, but also having a sense of what to do if a heat stroke does occur in terms of recognition and treatment. We work very closely at the Corey Stringer Institute with athletes, with our country's military, and with laborers to try to prevent them from happening in the first place, heat strokes, and also to be ready to treat them if they do occur. So if you ever need more information, please use the Corey Stringer Institute website if that could be helpful beyond the scope of the time that I have to share today. So in terms of preparing...
I'm sorry, this is George. I just wanted to ask the audience that if you do have questions, please submit it through the questions button, and we will address them after each speaker. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. So preparing athletes, coaches, and parents for extreme heat. So we're going to talk about the 8 pillars for preventing and treating heat stroke. So first, when we get in the realm of prevention, one of the first things that you can do to try to keep people safe during intense exercise in the heat is hydration. And I know you've heard this before, and it's not maybe something new for you to try to understand. But in terms of conceptualizing it and maybe explaining it to other people, for every additional 1% body mass loss, your body temperature is about 0.5 degree Fahrenheit hotter for any given intense exercise session in the heat. So if you stay hydrated, for instance, like maybe less than 2% of your body weight, you might be, say, 102 degrees your body weight. But if you get to be 4 or 5% dehydrated, which is very common in terms of your body weight losses, you might be, 103.5 or 104 degrees just for that minor difference in hydration. So hydration can be very protective during intense exercise in the heat. And you got to be proactive to obviously make sure the fluids are available as they are needed, and time is given to properly allow the individuals to have the proper amount of time to drink what they're losing in their sweat. Remind yourselves, and that's why we're hydrating, is because the main way we're going to cool ourselves during intense exercise in the heat is evaporation of sweat. And obviously, if we're losing fluid via sweat, we need to replace that. One really interesting thing people will find is that the fluid you consume actually can become part of your sweat in as little as 10 minutes after you consume it, which shows you how important and how quickly it can benefit you. Second is the concept of body cooling. Body cooling is anything you do to try to keep your body temperature down during activity in the heat. So that could be things like utilizing halftime. So you're using like cold water tubs, or you're using ice water towels. It could be during breaks during sporting activities. It could be purposefully instituting additional breaks. A great example would be like at elite soccer. If there isn't if the temperature is at a certain level, they have an additional halftime in the middle of each half of soccer. So now we want to see youth groups do additional things, because obviously if they're doing that at the elite level, we'd want to see that at the younger levels. So it means maybe modifying the rules of the sport to allow the athletes, especially the youth and children, to have additional times to cool themselves. It could be also just be providing shade and having cold fluids, having cooling towels available to those athletes. So body cooling is very powerful to try to, as a tool to keep body temperature down during intense exercise in the heat. And a lot of variety can exist in terms of how to accomplish that. Third item in terms of prevention is the concept of work-to-rest ratios. As was said during the first speaker today, the concept of wet bulb globe temperature, so WBGT, is really one of the fundamental ways of assessing the environmental load for an athlete, really for anybody, soldier or laborer, but specifically to athletes in this presentation, because it takes into account the environmental temperature, which is only 10% of the actual environmental load, the humidity, which is about 70% of the environmental load, and the direct effect from the sun, which is about 20% of the load. And it's those combination of those 3 factors which really helps us have the wet bulb globe temperature be allow us to make the best modifications. So if the WBGT is higher than normal, you would make modifications for the work-to-rest ratios. So like if so for instance, the state of Georgia for high school football has probably the most proactive policies where they have very specific wet bulb globe temperatures, and if you reach certain levels, it triggers more rest breaks that are longer during each hour of activity. So it takes the decision-making out of the coach's hands, and it puts it in the hands of the experts who had developed them based on what an athlete can typically tolerate, with equipment on and during intense exercise in the heat under particular environmental loads. So this is a very powerful tool that costs no money in terms of work-to-rest ratio modification based on the environmental conditions. We know that almost all heat stroke deaths that happen in sport, the environmental conditions are at least 1 standard deviation greater than normal for that particular region on that particular day, and usually it's 2 standard deviations greater. So if it's something beyond what you're used to. So really hot in Louisiana is different than really hot in Maine. If it's really hot in Maine, you may have to make modifications, and that might not even cross the threshold of being really hot for Louisiana. So you have to be flexible based on where you are and what they're used to, the people who are participating in the sport in that region. The fourth one is acclimatization. Heat acclimatization is a powerful physiological change that your body undergoes during the first 10 to 14 days of exercise in the heat. You, for instance, increase your sweat rate, you increase your plasma volume, you retain more of your sodium, you start sweating at a lower body temperature. You have a whole myriad of changes that allow you to more successfully enhance your exercise heat tolerance. And it's amazing because everybody can undergo heat acclimatization, and it does take at least 5 or 6 days to start getting, maybe 80% of the benefits, and it takes 10 to 14 days to probably be at around 99% of the benefits. And it's a powerful lesson that almost all heat stroke deaths in sport happen in the first 3 days of activity in the heat. And one of the big reasons for that is that the person is not yet heat acclimatized, and they're not fully able to deal with the stress of the heat. So the NCAA for college sports back in 2003 adapted countrywide heat acclimatization standards for summer training that have dramatically reduced the deaths in college football, almost actually eliminated them for August heat stroke deaths. And now in high schools, we're trying to get all high school athletic associations to adapt it for all the states in our country. And we have had great success. About 16 states have adapted the similar policies to the NCAA, and most of the ones in the Southeast have adapted them. And states that have adapted heat acclimatization protocols for high school football since 2011, when the first state, New Jersey and Texas being the first two, there has not been a death in high school football in a state that's been following heat acclimatization strategies. So that alone could have, up to this point, probably saved 15 to 20 high school football players' lives. And that's just an example of one sport and just across a few different states. So heat acclimatization, whether it be a soldier, athlete, or laborer, is a powerful tool. Always be more protective in the first 5 or 6 days. Be more conservative until the body increases its ability and increases its exercise heat tolerance. This is an example, looks obviously a little complicated slide, but this is an example of heat acclimatization for high school football, and it just shows that in the first few days, for instance, the first 5 days, you don't have any 2-a-day workouts, and then you don't ever have successive days of 2-a-days, and you phase in the amount of equipment over time. So just intuitively, it doesn't have to be football. It could be soccer or cross country or other things that you're doing, conditioning and hard exercise outside, that you want to ramp up gradually these stresses. So the big stresses are obviously the environmental conditions, the intensity, the equipment and clothing you're wearing, the rest breaks. I mean, obviously less rest breaks are more stressful. So those are some examples. This is an example of the deaths that had happened from 1980 through 2015 in the states that have and have not have heat acclimatization. But in 2011, the states here in red are the ones that have adapted heat acclimatization. And you'll notice there have been no deaths. There is one in Florida, but they actually were not following the heat acclimatization guidelines for the state, which once again is more ammunition of why we want heat acclimatization. They actually were having multiple exercise sessions on the very first day when the death took place there. And Hawaii actually used just the 16th state about a week ago to adopt the guidelines. The fifth one is education. Obviously, intuitively, all the things I've already mentioned: athletes, coaches, parents, athletic trainers. Athletic trainers are the healthcare professionals that are specifically trained to prevent, recognize, and treat heat stroke and a myriad of other things that can cause preventing sudden death in sport, whether it be cardiac or head injuries. But we're trying desperately to have every high school in America have an athletic trainer. We've made a lot of progress towards that. But obviously at the youth level, there might not be an athletic trainer at some events, and the education component of the things I've mentioned are key. So some of the things related to treatment, there's really 3 key things you need to consider when we want to know if it's a heat stroke or not. So is it a heat exhaustion, which could never kill you, or an exertional heat stroke, which the person would be likely to die if they're not treated properly? So the 2 big things that you would look for to have as a demarcation between those 2 conditions are body temperature and central nervous system dysfunction. So the body temperature, and that would have to be with an accurate temperature assessment like rectal temperature. You can't use tympanic or axillary or oral or AURAL or ORAL or skin or anything like that. They're not accurate during intense exercise in the heat. The research has conclusively shown. The rectal temperature over 105 at the time of collapse and CNS dysfunction, which could be things like extreme dizziness, collapse, confusion, coma, irritability, anything like that would be considered CNS dysfunction. If you suspect that starts in motion the process of cooling the person down as fast as humanly possible. That's the key for surviving exertional heat stroke. If you're not sure or you don't have a rectal temperature ability to get that on site or immediately, you're always better off assuming it's heat stroke until proven otherwise, so you can begin the cooling process, because you would never harm a heat exhaustion person by cooling them down. Treatment, the fastest way of cooling somebody down is cold water immersion. So, like, for instance, high schools across America and almost all colleges and almost all pro football teams and of all high school sports programs in the summertime have or should have like a Rubbermaid 150-gallon tub set up with ice and water on the sideline so that someone could begin cooling a person with heat stroke right away. And there's even now a lot of states that require cooling tubs to be at those football practices. To ensure survival, we got to get their temperature under 104 within 30 minutes. Probably technically maybe under 105 within 30 minutes, but to be safe, under 104 within 30 minutes. And in fact, in 2,300 cases of heat stroke we've tracked, they've had 0 deaths if you can get someone's temperature in exertional heat stroke if you get it under 104 within 30 minutes. So it needs to be recognized quickly, and it needs to be cooled on site. The standard of care for best practices for exertional heat stroke, if medical staff is there, for instance, like an athletic trainer at a high school or at a college or any other large-scale event where there's medical staff there, is the concept of cool first, transport second, because you don't want to lose any of the minutes of cooling that individual. So you recognize the heat stroke immediately, you put them in the cold water immersion tub, you call an ambulance, you finish their cooling in that cold water immersion tub, you get them down to 102 or 103, and then you send them to the hospital. And that maximizes the odds that they'll survive and their temperature will be under 104 within 30 minutes. So the cold water immersion, here's an example just of some pictures of the Rubbermaid tub and rectal temperature being monitored during that. In the bottom left is at Falmouth Road Race, where we've actually monitored 274 heat strokes in a recent publication, and all of them survived with immediate recognition and immediate cooling. The last thing I just wanted to mention quickly is the concept of return to play with heat stroke. If someone has a heat stroke, they have to undergo a similar kind of recovery and rehab process, just like any other medical condition or injury, because sometimes if they're not cooled aggressively and they survived, they may have long-term complications. Thankfully, the evidence strongly indicates if their temperature gets under 104 within 3 minutes, they actually not only survive, but they do not have long-term complications. And that's all I have right now. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Doug. I have a few questions from the audience, and again, for the next few presentations, I encourage you all to submit your questions. The first question I have for you is, how does this information about acclimatization to extreme heat in the athletic context get to the coaches? What are your avenues of communication?
That's a great question. So coaches at the high school level, we work through the states. Each state has a high school athletic association, and each state also has a sports medicine advisory committee that sets the standards. So some states are very proactive that require coaching education, even require beyond first aid, CPR, AED, and require, for instance, Georgia requires preventing sudden death in sport training, so they get very specific training on heat stroke and other emergency medical conditions. At youth levels like U.S. Soccer and other governing bodies, they're making efforts to require their coaches to have meet certain standards. One of the best examples is USA Football has a program called Heads Up Football, which educates the coaches regarding proper tackling and blocking, but it also has modules related to heat stroke, hydration, and cardiac issues. So it depends on the venue, the age of the athlete, but there are mechanisms, and we're continuing to try to enhance those.
Great. Thanks. One more question for you. Is there a tested curriculum for educating high school trainers on heat illness?
That is a great question. I mean, one of the first resources we'd always recommend is the National Athletic Trainers Association recently published a position statement on exertional heat illnesses that just came out about 6 months ago. So that's kind of the standard of care for athletic trainers in our country. We ourselves at the Corey Stringer Institute produced a very intensive continuing education course that hundreds of athletic trainers have taken to advance their knowledge related to heat stroke. But the position statement would be the thing we would recommend in terms of being accessible to everyone and obviously having no cost and really establishing the standard. There's one other document I'll quickly mention. It's Preventing Sudden Death in Secondary School Settings. That document came out in 2013, a very brief document on the very the most necessary items you need to prevent heat stroke, cardiac, head injuries, and the most serious things that could happen to a high school athlete.
Okay. One other question, just because I like it. What kind of risk factors or pre-existing conditions should athletes be screened for in advance of exposure to extreme heat? For example, kidney disease or impaired function. Are there any pre-existing factors that can be screened for?
That's a great question. The most important things, honestly, are infrastructure things that I talked about in prevention, making sure they're heat acclimatized, making sure they're fit. Fitness is really important. That'll enhance the heat acclimatization process, and fitness enhances your exercise heat tolerance, allowing proper time to hydrate, having work-to-rest ratios that are based on the environmental conditions. Another important item is to try to eliminate or minimize supplements that they're taking, and being aware of drugs or medications, like anything that rev up the engine, like amphetamines or amphetamine-like substances, ephedra or ephedra-like substances, or things like that people might use for like ADHD medication. Those are all things that you should consider that might cause someone to have a decreased exercise heat tolerance.
Great. Thanks so much, Doug. And now let's move on to our second speaker. Our second speaker, Ms. Kathleen Votava, will discuss special considerations in preparing the elderly and their caregivers for extreme heat. Ms. Votava has over 20 years of experience in the field of aging, where she has worked at the local, state, and federal levels, administering and providing consultation on programs for older adults. Currently, she's an Aging Services Program Specialist in the Office of Regional Operations with the Administration for Community Living, Administration on Aging, where she provides grant management and consultation to state units on aging, on long-term services and support systems, and serves as the point person for disaster preparedness. Kathleen has earned a degree in gerontology as well as a Master's of Public Administration. Ms. Votava, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. I'll be talking about preparing the elderly and their caregivers for extreme heat events. So as you're probably aware, more older adults are living in their own homes within their communities, more so than in nursing facilities. So these older adults have and require interdependent caregiving systems and arrangements. So it's very important that they and their caregivers are prepared and have plans in place for events such as extreme heat. So some considerations for older adults during extreme heat events. Older adults are less likely to sense and respond to changes in temperature. They may not be able to compensate for heat stress efficiently. Also, they're more likely to have chronic medical conditions that changes the normal body responses to heat or make them more vulnerable to extreme heat. Approximately 50% of those seniors age 65 and over have 2 or more chronic health problems. Another consideration when we're talking about extreme heat conditions and chronic medical conditions is oftentimes with the extreme heat conditions that includes poor air quality and stagnant atmospheric conditions, which may aggravate chronic health conditions such as chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD, for example, emphysema. So that may aggravate that chronic health condition. And also seniors are more likely to take prescription medicines that impair the body's ability to regulate its temperature or inhibit perspiration. So seniors are at a real risk for dehydration. So some tips that we like to give to seniors is they definitely should stay in air-conditioned environments during the extreme heat period. If the senior has air conditioning in their home, we encourage them to turn it on. We know oftentimes seniors are reluctant to turn on that air conditioning, but definitely turn it on. If they don't have air conditioning during the warmest part of the day, definitely encourage them to go to community facilities that have air conditioning, such as senior centers, shopping mall, public library, their place of worship, or a designated cooling center. And keep in mind, too, that many older adults may have issues with transportation. They may not drive, and public transportation might not be an option for them. So it's good to have a plan in place before the extreme heat event to know where they're going to be going as far as the air-conditioned environment, and also how they're going to get there. Oftentimes, they can contact their local area agency on aging or their local city or county department on aging or health and human services to get information on transportation. For example, in the city of Chicago, they can call the city's 311 to request transportation to a cooling center. So we also encourage seniors to drink more water than usual, and definitely don't wait until they're feeling thirsty. With that consideration, though, as I said, seniors are definitely at a risk for dehydration. As we know, some older adults are on a restricted fluid intake because of kidney disease or another health issue, and they should really consult with their physician before increasing their fluid intake. Seniors may be on diuretics or water pills, for instance, if they have a high blood pressure. And then also, seniors may just be in the habit of self-limiting their fluid intake if they're incontinent or have mobility issues that make it difficult for them to get to the restroom or bathroom. So definitely keep that in mind. And it may sound old-fashioned, but we do encourage seniors and caregivers and neighbors to check on each other during events of extreme heat. For instance, seniors can use a buddy system. They can have a pre-plan to meet with their friends up at a cooling center to check on each other. Family caregivers should check on their loved ones more frequently during this time. And definitely encourage neighbors to check on those seniors that may live alone or are very elderly. And kind of find out, too, beforehand, again, in the planning stage or being prepared for extreme heat, to kind of check with either your city or county to see how they handle extreme heat for seniors. For example, they may open cooling centers, knowing the location of the cooling centers. Give the example of the city of Chicago. Residents can call 311 if they have a concern for an elderly neighbor who lives alone, and they'll send out a community worker to check on that. Another thing is, like we want to tell seniors, is do not use their stove or oven to cook. Of course, it'll make the house hotter. So what we advocate for is to have either the family caregivers get prepared meals for their older loved ones, or if the older adult does cook, to prepare those meals before the extreme heat event. Other tips are wear loose, lightweight, light-colored clothing, and definitely seek medical attention immediately if showing symptoms of heat-related illness such as headaches, nausea, vomiting, or muscle cramps. So some examples and resources related to heat safety and older adults. The state of Arizona has a really great older adult toolkit for heat safety, the Arizona Department of Health Services. And within this toolkit is a caregiver document that provides caregivers with information on signs, symptoms, and treatment of heat illness so that they can recognize the symptoms and learn how to treat and prevent its occurrence. Also within this toolkit, there is some education materials. One is a heat illness crossword puzzle, and another is a Beat the Heat poster. And so that helps to educate older adults about heat safety. The Missouri Department of Health and Senior Services uses the GIS mapping software, which shows a map that shows all the cooling centers in the state. And you can also search the map for your local cooling center, either by putting in your address, your zip code, or your county, for those seniors that are more tech savvy and their caregivers, or definitely contact the local area agency on aging to find the closest cooling center. The CDC is a great resource for extreme heat for older adults for guides and information and tips. And then also FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management, has ready.gov, which is also another excellent resource for preparedness information, including extreme heat. So that includes my briefing on preparing elderly and caregivers. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now to some questions here. What advice do you have for seniors and caregivers that are in rural areas where transportation and cooling shelter infrastructure are less developed or accessible?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's definitely an ongoing challenge. Again, just kind of looking at what you have planned for those extreme heat events that may be going to a relative's house for that period of time that may have air conditioning. So kind of getting them out of the house overnight also. But that is definitely a challenge.
Thank you. One more question. This is from a community that has had reports having great success with passive cooling approaches, which involves roof coating, restoring proper ventilation to the home, green canopy around homes, etc., and employing the use of fans rather than mechanical cooling. In the context of high energy prices, many low-income seniors are unwilling to run up their electric bill and need affordable cooling solution. Do you have any experience with programs that try to implement these approaches?
I do not, and definitely cost is an issue for seniors who are low income or on a fixed income as far as running their, if they do have air conditioning. There are programs available like LIHEAP, the Low Income Home Energy Assistance Program, so the older adult may be eligible for that to help with those costs.
Great. Are there any health-based standards for indoor thermal conditions for assisted living facilities or hospitals that you're aware of?
I am not aware of any, but that's a great question.
One final one. Beyond the toolkits that you presented, can you recommend a specific heat stress training curriculum for elder services workers?
I cannot recommend a specific training. Definitely look at your state's public health department. You can contact them. I think, again, CDC is a great resource also.
Thank you, Ms. Votava. Now on to our third speaker, Ms. Kelly Schnapp, who will discuss occupational issues and heat. Ms. Schnapp is the director of the DOL OSHA Office of Science and Technology Assessment in the Directorate of Technical Support and Emergency Management. She has served in OSHA for almost 2 years, in which her office developed compliance guidance resources on preventing green tobacco sickness, amputations, fall protection in construction, zip-line worker safety, access to restrooms, and preventing other physical chemical injuries, illnesses, or fatalities. Her office maintains OSHA's heat safety tool and provides technical support to OSHA Office of Communications for their annual heat campaign. Thank you, Ms. Schnapp, for joining us today. We look forward to your presentation.
Thank you for inviting me to talk specifically about what extreme heat means to workers, specifically because they're susceptible to heat illness with the exertion in their daily work. In 2014 alone, 2,630 workers suffered from heat illnesses and 18 died from heat stroke and related causes on the job. The message today that I want to send is that extreme heat is real and heat illness is preventable. Employers are legally obligated to protect their workers, and supervisors have a unique role in empowering workers to use the water, rest, and shade that is provided. I'll also talk briefly at the end about some unique resources and tools available to help on OSHA's website. This slide is intended to show that the heat-related cases in 2012 to 13, the federal OSHA investigated 84 cases in which 23 resulted in death. The images on your screen there are 23 images, and these are representing the 23 deaths. 17 of those, the ones that are red, represent how many died within the first 3 days on the job. A Cal OSHA study found that 80% of heat injuries happen within a new worker's first 4 days of work. Outdoor workers are especially at risk for heat illness due to environmental heat exposure and the exertion that generates additional internal heat as they work. These new workers are susceptible since they are most likely not acclimatized. Supervisors are in a unique position to set the tone that drinking water, taking appropriate opportunities to rest, and using shade is important and part of the job. The following few slides will highlight the need not only to provide water, rest, and shade at the workplace, but to ensure the workplace safety culture supports the appropriate use from the first day on the job. This first example, as an enforcement agency, we do see cases. So I'm going to show 3 different examples of cases that tragically ended to bring reality to the situation. This example is a 36-year-old male employee. He was working in an open trench in direct sunlight and carrying heavy equipment. This happened on his first day on the job. This person was probably not accustomed to outdoor work or physical activity, and they're much more likely to suffer heat illness. Many people who start on their first job don't necessarily know their limits, the symptoms of heat illness, or and they don't want to appear slow or lazy. Supervisors should give specific attention to acclimatizing workers as they start work. This example was a 60-year-old temporary worker. They were working on the deck of a ship, and they were specifically in direct sunlight and near reflective water. Medics arrived and found his core body temperature was 107.9 degrees. He was transported to the hospital where he died a few hours later. It's another example of how water, rest, and shade is important not only to be provided, but to use. This example is a unique one because it shows the impact that outdoor temperatures may have on indoor work. The 64-year-old male employee, after working several hours inside, collapsed from heat illness and died on the job. The temperature outside was 100 degrees. OSHA investigators found that the company did not provide temperature controls in the work area, and they failed to train workers on how to recognize and avoid heat-related illnesses. They also didn't implement a work-rest regimen for workers. So as you've heard from other speakers, prevention is extremely important. OSHA's motto for prevention is water, rest, and shade. Some things to consider and some simple steps that employers and supervisors can do to save lives for workers working in hot environments include instituting a heat acclimatization plan and medical monitoring program, encouraging workers to drink about 1 cup of water every 15 to 20 minutes, provide shaded or air-conditioned rest areas for cooling down, empowering workers to use them, provide workers with protective equipment and clothing. This can include water-cooled garments, air-cooled garments, hats, ice pack vests, wetted overgarments, and heat-reflected aprons or suits if they're inside. And be familiar with heat illness signs and symptoms to make sure that employees are also aware and looking out for their other coworkers. The other important factor is recognizing and responding to heat illness signs and symptoms. As discussed before, these symptoms are very well known, and we have resources to give you more information at the end. But it's important to train and encourage workers to report heat symptoms early. OSHA recommends using a buddy system, coworker watching out for the other coworker. Oftentimes, the person experiencing heat illness may not be aware because one of the symptoms could be disorientation, or they wouldn't be as aware as the person next to them. First thing is important is notifying supervisors or requesting medical assistance, moving the worker to a cooler place to rest in the shade, never leaving them alone, giving them a little bit of water little by little as long as they're conscious or not vomiting, loosening the clothing, and cooling the worker down by fanning, using ice packs in the armpits or groin, or soaking the person's clothing with cold water. Medical care early is important, not to wait. Now I want to talk about a unique tool that OSHA provides as a public service. This is the Heat Safety Tool mobile application. It's downloadable from either an iOS or an Android store. This is the image you would see if you went to your phone and you went to your store or app store. You would just click on OSHA's Heat Safety Tool. What this tool does is it connects with and it uses the heat connects to NOAA's heat index. And based on your location and at the time that you turn this app on and open it up, if you have your GPS on, it'll automatically tell you not only in color but in wording what your current risk is. You can also manually type in other areas or manually type in temperature and humidity. We just recently updated this to show that the color fills the screen so that you have a quick visual representation of what your risk level is. Here are some examples I pulled up just for demonstration. Once you've done this, you have the option to click on more information to get guidance on how to prevent heat illness based on your risk level. These are the different types of screens you'll see for a lower risk, a moderate risk, and a high risk. Each screen shows a little bit added protection based on your risk level. These screens actually scroll down, so there's a lot more information than what's shown here. Also in this app, there are quick reference guides. When you go to more info, you can get some more details on drinking water, some visual signs and symptoms help, quick notes on what to look for, and then also some information about the public service itself. OSHA also has a heat campaign webpage that's available, and it's updated yearly. It has some neat interactive things. The water rush shade sticky note on the side actually moves when you go to the website, and it's a vine, so you can see some action there. And this site has a lot of useful information specifically dedicated for protecting workers from heat illness. Thank you very much for this time.
Thank you so much. We have a few questions. First is, are there any considerations or research for outdoor workers to use personal tools like Fitbits to monitor their temperature?
I can't really speak to using Fitbits particular for heat illness indications. I mean, my awareness of Fitbits is it measures your pulse. We don't have anything specifically linking Fitbits to any tools that we particularly provide, unfortunately.
Okay. It seems that many of the actions that are being proposed to protect workers from extreme heat might be limited by the supervisory environment in which they're in, whether they might be limited in their ability to take breaks, get hydrated, etc. Can you speak about efforts to educate the sort of caretakers of workers, supervisors, etc., on how to recognize or prevent these illnesses from happening in the workplace?
Absolutely. Our heat campaign is focused on letting the employer know and the supervisors that represent the employers that they're responsible for making sure that their workers are protected from the hazards, the heat hazards. The General Duty Clause requires employers to provide a workplace free from recognized and known hazards. We have also seen associations pitch this info as well. So we have connections with alliances and connections with associations that share the same message. Safety culture is extremely important, and that is established to the employer and the supervisor, and OSHA sends that message through our campaign.
Great. I believe Dr. Casa wants to answer the Fitbit question. Are we able to get his voice on?
Yes, a very good question before, and really important to remember. In fact, last week I was at a meeting at the Air Force Research Labs. And we talked about different technologies that exist for real-time hydration assessment or body temperature assessment. And at this point, it's really important to remember that during intense exercise in the heat, there's no wearable right now that has been proven valid to know your body temperature during that activity. So we have to, the great presentation that just took place, that she noted, keeping track of signs and symptoms, early warning indicators, looking out for your peers, and doing the right things to prepare yourself to prevent it from happening in the first place are the key items, and backing off if you don't feel well, like you said, with the rest, the shade, and the water, the key things that we need to do right now. But we need a rectal temperature from a medical professional to really have an accurate idea of what their body temperature is. Thank you.
Dr. Costa, is there a hierarchy of various ways of measuring temperature in individuals going from the least to the most accurate?
Well, that's the whole thing. That's a great point that a lot of people bring up. The other ones just don't work. There's not even a correlation. Some of the work that we've done, they could be 5, 6, 7 degrees away from reality for a heat stroke victim, but they don't correlate. So There's not like a correction factor you could utilize. They're really dangerous because a tympanic might tell you a person's 101 or an axillary or an oral, and then you don't move forward with the aggressive cooling. You're better off utilizing the signs and symptoms in front of you, like CNS dysfunction, assume it's a heat stroke, and begin aggressive cooling.
Thanks, Doug. And thank you, Kelly. I'm sorry, did you want to respond to that?
I just have something to add to that. I wanted to say, just like all those other tools, the Heat app is a tool. It's not a replacement for training. And just to emphasize what we just said, is training people to recognize symptoms is essential. The Heat app is one tool to help understand the risk at the time.
Great point. Thanks, Kelly. Our fourth and final panel presentation, Dr. Bob England will present on preparing emergency responders and public health officials for extreme heat. Dr. Bob England is the director of the Maricopa County Department of Public Health. At 4 million people, it's the third most populous local public health jurisdiction in the U.S. Since he began in this position nearly 10 years ago, his mission has been to look for innovative solutions to rebuild the local public health infrastructure in a very resource-poor environment. He's been a public health doctor his entire career and has held several positions in state or local public health in Arizona and in Connecticut, including twice being the state epidemiologist for Arizona. Dr. England is the director of the Maricopa County Department of Public Health. Oh, that was repeated. Sorry about that, Dr. Bob. The floor is yours.
No problem. Hey, thanks for the opportunity to share our experiences here. First off, if you're not from the West, you need to know that counties out here are very large geographically. If you look at our county on that first slide, that's outlined in yellow in the center of the state. We're roughly the size of the state of Massachusetts, but nearly everybody lives in the Metro Phoenix area in that sort of oval-shaped outline there. We have more than 60% of the state's population in this area, and now we're up over 4 million people. We've always been known for being hot, but as the metro area has grown, the heat island effect from structures has certainly exacerbated that. We have a very long summer. We're already into the time when we're usually up over 100 degrees for our highs. That'll go until October. And importantly, we have 13 days on average where our low temperature doesn't fall below 90 degrees, and we'll talk more about that in just a bit here. Back in 2005, we did not have a formal heat surveillance system in place, but a cluster of heat-related deaths was noted, as you can see on the bars on this chart, in mid-July of 2005. And importantly, if you look at that top line of maximum temperature there, the max temperature really had been pretty consistent throughout that period. But if you look at the lower line of the minimum temperature, we had several days where our low was hovering around 90 degrees in a row. And if you don't have an artificially cooled environment you can be in part of the day, that means that people who were without that spent several days where their bodies would have a really difficult time cooling off and recovering from the high point in the day. So that cluster of deaths was noted by our first responder agencies, our medical examiner, and others. The media began to cover it, and heat-related deaths got a lot of attention that summer of 2005. That prompted a large number of organizations to come together, headed up by the Maricopa Association of Governments, which is an inter-municipal government organization. Cities and towns, all sorts of other nonprofit organizations came together, and we quickly created a system of dealing with the heat, mostly at first focusing on homeless individuals, because that's where the anecdotal reports of heat-related deaths were focusing that summer. We created cooling centers where people could go into an air-conditioned environment to get out of the heat. Those are mostly public libraries and government buildings and such. created water collection and distribution sites, and organized a network of volunteers to check on people, either outdoors among the homeless or the homebound as well. Along with that was a public information campaign with some of the information that you already heard talked about, but also how to be outdoors and still enjoy the outdoors and do it responsibly. And importantly, this happens every year. Some usually small number, but every year children get left in cars, usually while the parent goes in to run a quick errand. And I'm telling you, a car here with our temperatures can hit 140 degrees in about 10 minutes. So we're always hyping on people to remind them never to do that. So here's what happened. If you look at the yellow line across this graph, this starts with in 2006 because remember in 2005 we didn't have a surveillance system in place. The health department created one to look at the circumstances surrounding heat-related deaths beginning in 2006. And if you look at the yellow line, which is the percent of deaths that were among homeless individuals, I'm pretty confident that we've done a good job of decreasing deaths in the homeless due to heat. However, if you look at the total height of the bars, we're still hovering around the same level, 75 to 100 or so deaths pretty much every year. More people die from heat than all other weather-related deaths in our country, and we contribute more than our share, it seems. Excuse me. So, looking at why people are dying now, or more to the point, who is dying, most of our deaths actually occur outdoors. And while most of them are within our urban area, there's a surprising number that are out in the desert. Those are primarily folks who are recreating. They're out hiking. And so thus the continued emphasis at the entrance to our parks and in all other sorts of ways, emphasis on watching yourself, watching for signs, drinking plenty of water, taking breaks, cooling off, and so forth. I mentioned there's a consistent, small but consistent number of deaths in cars, which are mostly kids. Of those that died indoors, we're seeing an interesting pattern. There's a significant chunk that just don't have air conditioning, period. It's not broken, it's just they just don't have AC. I mean, people did live here prior to the invention of air conditioning. We see a good chunk who have working air conditioners. Nearly a fourth of the deaths indoors have working air conditioners, but they're not turned on, and I will talk more about that in just a second. And then the biggest chunk are people whose either their AC was broken or their electricity has been turned off. So we've done a number of evaluations and such following up on this system over time. Most recently, 2 years ago, we did a cooling center evaluation and saw, surprisingly, we list online on heataz.org the locations of all these cooling centers. But surprisingly, more than half of them did not have signs actually on the buildings to direct people that this was a place where they could come and get cool. So we have, as a result of that evaluation, increased visibility and increased hours for these cooling centers, and we're hopeful that as we repeat evaluations over time, that will have helped. Those of you who are in the world of emergency preparedness will recognize the term CASPR, Community Assessment for Public Health Emergency Response. we did a community survey last year and found that the cost of electricity during the summer is significant enough to cause to influence behavior of a large number of people. Up to a fourth of folks said that the cost of electricity was a real barrier. And yet most of those individuals had no idea that there were utility assistance programs available. LIHEAP was already mentioned in an earlier address, low-income home energy assistance program. I would hasten to point out, though, as we increase awareness of that and applications for it, that the funding tends to be skewed more toward cold weather states. And not that that's not important, but as the climate continues to warm, and as we heard extreme heat emergencies accelerate, this could be really important to skew the money more toward where there are going to be heat emergencies. And we're currently doing a homebound population assessment funded by the Public Health Institute to focus on linking homebound to cooling resources. So my bottom line is mixed results, a lot of effort, great community cooperation, real positive impact on the homeless, but across the board, we clearly have a lot more to do. And I'm going to stop right there.
Thank you, Dr. England. Great presentation. I have a question on heat stress and homeless populations. Are there any formal recommendations as they pertain to Maricopa's homeless community?
Yeah, the cooling centers were largely designed to reflect where we had numbers of homeless locating. In our community, we have something called the Human Services Campus, where a number of homeless service agencies operate, and one-stop shop, if you will, for homeless services, and that's our largest homeless population center. And they are, the agencies there and their support agencies are in the neighborhoods around there, encouraging homeless folks to come in and get cool, providing copious amounts of water whenever we can. And it is most important that people have a chance for their bodies to cool off. We can all take a surprising amount of heat if we're not exerting ourselves in it. But you really need the opportunity to get in and cool off, and to recognize that your body can get into trouble before you know it.
Well, one more question, and this pertains to cooling centers. Are you aware of the cooling center opening requirements, like a threshold of a temperature, et cetera, at which they become open?
Yeah, we announce it when the season starts, when we cross a certain threshold. I should know that top of my head, but I don't remember what the actual temperature requirements are. But they're open before we think people are likely to get into serious trouble.
Great, thank you. And thank you, Dr. England, for your presentation, and for all the panel members for your presentations. We have a few minutes before our closing remarks by Dr. Kleinenberg for some general Q&A. And I would like to pose one question to the whole panel and their various perspectives before we move into that, and that is the fact that extreme heat is an underappreciated weather hazard, perhaps because of the fact that it doesn't leave a physical trail of destruction in our communities. If you're inside an air-conditioned house looking outside during a hot day, it looks just the same as a cold day. And that's why many have described it as a silent killer, which might explain part of the reason why it has such a high impact on morbidity and mortality. So in our various communities that we're addressing, from supervisors, workers, caretakers of the elderly, coaches, how can we best raise the recognition of this threat amongst those important communities who are charged with taking care of our most vulnerable populations? And I might just start with Doug.
That's a really good question. The biggest thing for us to consider is what I mentioned earlier in my talk is if the weather is beyond the normal, if it's hotter than it normally would be for you in your given location, to really step back and take precautions and think, who do I need to be looking out for? If it's a coach, it's my athletes. If it's a parent, it's your kids as you're sending them out to that exercise session or that practice session. If it's a league official, it's mandating extra breaks during a game, changing the rules of the game to put safety ahead of tradition. Those would be some of the big things. If it's just more extreme than usual, that's when almost all the problems happen, and really protect them in the first 4 or 5 days of heat exposure.
Great, thanks. Ms. Votava, is this an issue in your community that is identified as a very important one that capacity needs to be augmented, or is there a lack of recognition of this as a credible threat to health?
Yeah, I think there also is a lack of recognition, and it is definitely a threat to health for seniors and their caregivers. As I mentioned, many seniors are also dealing with chronic health issues, which makes them particularly vulnerable to extreme heat conditions. So I think it's great that once we know that an extreme heat event is coming, to get that plan of action, get the messaging out to seniors. Definitely the seniors and their caregivers know where they're going to go, what activities they're going to do for the heat event, if they can stay at home and if they have air conditioning, or if they need to go to a environment that's cool.
Thank you. Ms. Schnapp, within your occupational health community, which encounters a wide variety of threats to health, physical threats to health, how is extreme heat considered in the pantheon of threats?
It's taken very seriously. We have seen, way too many deaths over the years, and and to your point of getting the word out, we make sure anything we put out about heat is also available in Spanish. We want to make sure that the information we have to share is available to the Spanish-speaking community as well as the English-speaking community. And we also work with our state coordinators, and the state plan states, get the word out. We try and spread our influence through our alliances. And we also have a call with meteorologists every year. We have our assistant secretary on the phone, and we help sort of give them talking points and what to give during their weather announcements every year. So we try and reach every possible point that we could that a worker or supervisor or employer would actually be, paying attention to in their daily life.
Great, thanks. Dr. England, now to you. Within the emergency response community, they are well accustomed to dealing with large-scale threats to life and property, and things that come to mind, hurricanes and large storms really capture their attention. How well does heat waves or extreme heat events fit into their priorities for preparing an adaptation?
I think our first responder community and agencies tasked with protecting the public have a better appreciation of this than the general public does. So we're very aware. All of the agencies I'm aware of gear up and expect to have heat emergency runs because we do a lot of them every year. As I said, up to 100 or so deaths a year is a significant issue for even a community as large as us. I would like to point out one other thing to sort of echo what Kathleen Votava said about checking on neighbors. It was really gratifying to see the community response to the issue in 2005 and going forward from there, because that year sort of brought it to the general public's attention. And I actually think our messaging at the start of the summer can be a real opportunity to build a sense of community here. We live in an era in which people don't know all their neighbors, but if you can spread the message that says, look, you may not know all your neighbors, but if you look out and their windows are open when it's 100 degrees outside, that means their air conditioning is off. And that's an opportunity to go check on people and introduce yourself, because that's not a normal thing to have windows hanging open in our summers.
Great point and a great word of advice. Thank you. I'd like to thank all the panelists for their wonderful presentations and great insights into this emerging and increasingly emergent health hazard. I'd like to now switch to our closing comments portion of our webinar today, and am honored to invite Dr. Eric Kleinenberg, who is a professor of sociology and the director of the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University. He is the author of Heat Wave, A Social Autopsy of Disaster in Chicago, which I have on my bookshelf, and several award-winning books. He has also served as the research director for the federal Rebuild by Design competition, which is part of President Obama's Hurricane Sandy Rebuilding Task Force. Dr. Kleinenberg, thank you so much for your time and for your closing remarks.
Thank you, and thanks to everyone who's still here, even though I know you now have a lot of work to do to get ready for the heat that's coming. What I want to do is take you to the most significant real case that we've experienced in the United States of a major heat wave in recent memory. So you're looking at an image of my hometown, the city I grew up in, Chicago, which in 1995 experienced a heat disaster of historic proportion. And I want to go back to this case because I think we can learn a lot from our recent history. And unfortunately, I think that while there are many health agencies around the country and cities around the country that recognize what happened there, too many of our communities have failed to take seriously the lessons from that week. So let's look at what happens when a city breaks down and what we can do to prevent these kinds of disasters in the future. The first thing we should note is that when there's extreme heat these days, everyone turns on their air conditioner. In a place like Phoenix, you need to do that, but it's increasingly true for communities all over the country. Unfortunately, many of us live in places where the power grid is now overwhelmed by our demands. That was certainly the case in Chicago in 1995. The city set its record for energy consumption. The power grid couldn't sustain supply. And you're looking at emergency workers spraying down the substation, trying to keep power going. You won't be surprised to know that that did not work. About 250,000 households and far more people than that lost power during this heat wave, where temperatures hit 106 degrees. And the heat index, which is like the experienced heat, kind of like the wind chill in a winter's day, was 126 at times. Now we know that in the future this might be an ordinary temperature, but in 1995 that was extreme. People lacked air conditioning when they needed it most. Unfortunately, people also couldn't get access to water in many neighborhoods. We know that in high-rise buildings, when the electricity is out, not only can you not take an elevator, but you can't pump water up above the 5th or 6th floor. And unfortunately, in many neighborhoods in Chicago, everyone opened fire hydrants because that's the survival strategy if you don't have access to air conditioning. Thousands of hydrants were opened at the same time, and some neighborhoods experienced a real loss of water pressure and access because of that. You're looking at what the newspaper described as water wars in the city when officers and city personnel came out to try to keep the hydrants closed, and this resulted in real conflict on the street. In many cities around the country, in many communities, children go to camp during the summer. They're taken around to camps on school buses, old school buses that often don't have air conditioning. There are major traffic jams during a heat wave, as there often are, because transit systems break down, bridges might not open and close, trains don't run on time, the power gets backlogged, and the traffic gets backlogged as well. Unfortunately, many children became sick with heat-related illnesses, and the best strategy the city had at the time was to try to distribute water or literally spray children down. Unfortunately, that didn't work too well either. There are about 45 hospitals in the city of Chicago. During the heat wave in 1995, more than half of them went on bypass status, which means they literally had to close the doors to their emergency rooms. They could not admit any new patients. They were just overwhelmed by the number of very sick people who were being taken there for urgent care. Unfortunately, Chicago, like many cities at that time, I don't know how many cities are like this today, Chicago did not have a good system for monitoring which hospitals had filled their emergency rooms and could not take new patients in, and which hospitals were open. And as a result of that, ambulances, which were already in incredible demand and behind schedule, would drive in traffic-laden city streets, in some cases for up to 10 miles, looking for a hospital that could admit someone to provide them urgent care. We've already learned how important it is to cool someone immediately during a case of heat stress or heat stroke. And in this case, people just could not get the care and support that they needed. Unfortunately, heat waves are very much unlike other impending natural disasters. If a hurricane is coming towards your community, everyone in the area has their attention fixed on the problem. The weather channels, news reporters focus on images of what the storm looks like. We track the storms coming for days in advance. We all become experts on what's the difference between a Category 1 or a Category 3 hurricane. We focus. When we focus collectively, when the media focuses, that means that political officials have to focus on the disaster as well and have to prepare. What we have seen consistently in case after case is that even though heat waves kill more Americans than all of the other so-called natural disasters, we fail to track them as they're moving towards us in the way that we track other hazards. And what that means is that political officials, like many other people in cities, get out of town when the extreme heat comes. That certainly happened in 1995. The mayor, the head of the fire department, which monitors and runs the paramedics, the head of the health department, all were outside of Chicago as the heat approached and as the heat hit. And as a consequence, the city failed to issue a heat emergency. In fact, the city of Chicago had a heat emergency plan on the books, and it forgot that it had one. No one activated it. That's the kind of thing that doesn't happen in larger, more spectacular disasters like hurricanes or floods, but that happens all too often in heat waves. The result was truly catastrophic. It's not just that the hospitals in the city were overwhelmed. First tens, and then scores, and then hundreds of people began to die. The bodies were taken to the morgue at the center of the city. The bays in the medical examiner's office filled up. They literally had no place to keep the dead bodies. They had to bring in a fleet of 10 refrigerated meatpacking trucks about 50 feet long to cool the bodies. This is truly a horrifying scene, and it happened during a very recent period of American history. What we were later able to learn is that 739 residents of Chicago, in excess of the norm, died that week. There were 521 official heat-related deaths, but you need an actual investigation, an autopsy, a police report of an individual case to find a heat-related death. And what we know for certain is that cities have failed to monitor and recognize when people are dying of heat. And so literally hundreds of cases just don't register. That's why epidemiologists increasingly rely on this excess death figure, which is the number of people who die in addition to the normal number of people who would die during a given period of time. We look to see if there's a dip after an event to see if the heat wave was harvesting deaths that might have happened soon afterwards. Unfortunately, in this case, it does not seem like that was the case. What was very striking about the heat wave in Chicago, and what's very concerning for people who follow heat and health now, is the number of people who didn't just die but also died alone. They were discovered in their homes, in some cases hours, in other cases days after they perished. And this is really disturbing for a city like Chicago that considers itself a city of neighborhoods and strong communities. It's the kind of thing that should not happen, and yet it says something about who we are and how we live today. When news media in the city reported on what happened, they provided headlines that said things like casualties of the heat were just like most of us. And one of the commissioners of a city agency that provides emergency health services said that we're talking about people who die because they neglect themselves. But in fact, what we know from the best social research is that neither one of those arguments is true. The people who died in the heat wave had very specific risk profiles. First of all, the people who died tended to be old. If you were over 65 years old, you had a much higher chance of dying. They tended to be socially isolated. They had far fewer contacts than people who survived. They were disproportionately African American. They were disproportionately poor. They were very rarely Latino, on the other hand. What we also know is that the place where you lived mattered. People who lived in very poor neighborhoods died. Now that's exactly what we'd expect. But in fact, it's much more interesting than that when you look closely. And this is something I did in my book about the heat wave. The neighborhoods that had the highest death rates tended to look like this. They were not just poor, they were also depleted and abandoned. They had suffered great losses of population and of commercial infrastructure, of social infrastructure in the years leading up to the heat wave. They were places where vulnerable people did not really have places to go where they could find social support. So if they lived alone, they were much more likely to bunker themselves at home. And unfortunately, if they didn't have access to air conditioning, as so many people in Chicago did not, they became very vulnerable. On the other hand, neighborhoods that had the same demographic profile, the same poverty levels, the same proportion of very old people living alone, if they looked like this, they had a much higher chance of survival because people who live in a neighborhood with a viable social infrastructure are drawn out towards their neighbors. And it's important to think about the social context that we create in cities as we're planning for these kinds of emergencies in the future. A lot of the work we have to do to prepare happens not just during the heat wave, not just specifically around weather events, but around planning cities and communities more generally. One of the most amazing things about this heat wave is that, in fact, if you looked at the neighborhoods that were least likely to have deaths, the areas with the lowest death rates in the city, 3 of them were almost entirely African American with high levels of poverty and relatively high violent crime rates compared to the city in general. What the low death neighborhoods in Chicago shared is that they had very little population decline relative to the city. They were neighborhoods that had sustained a social infrastructure and had an environment where people could connect and support each other. Why haven't you heard much about the heat wave in the last 20 years? It's because this is really an invisible and silent disaster. What you're looking at is a scene from following the disaster. Dozens of people who died were never claimed by relatives or by family. They were buried together in a suburban cemetery, and we have largely forgotten about what happened to them. In fact, even the city of Chicago failed to hold public hearings on what went wrong that week, and the final report from the mayor's office included an image of a snowflake on the cover and failed to use the phrase heat wave to describe what had happened. What that means is when we fail to learn from the past, we make it so much easier for future heat disasters to be deadly. In Europe, we've already learned in 2003 somewhere between 35,000 and 70,000 people died from the heat, and political officials all over the continent said we couldn't know that was so dangerous because nothing like this has happened before. We're moving into a period, as we've learned, where we will have hotter, longer, and more frequent heat waves. The risks of these kinds of events recurring have grown greater. On the one hand, we've learned quite a lot about what to do to prepare for a heat emergency. Cities have to monitor the weather and distinguish between ordinary heat and truly treacherous heat, which they now know how to do. It's imperative that cities, that health officials work with local media to get the word out. It's essential that we know where there are old people who are isolated and provide all kinds of assistance to them. It's urgent that we monitor hospitals and declare emergencies when the heat is coming so that we use all the resources at our disposal to treat this like a real, serious health crisis. But unfortunately, and this is where I'll close, there's a larger heat emergency that we are all facing. We have hotter and longer summers coming. We continue to live in cities and regions where the power grid is inadequate to sustain air conditioning when we need it most. We have a population that's increasingly old and isolated, and we have city service agencies that are overwhelmed by their needs. All of this takes place in the context of growing urbanization, which means the heat island effect, where you have cities that are hotter during the day and also hotter than the surrounding areas at night because they trap the heat. These are becoming more common. And so the threats, the challenges are formidable. It's why it's so important that we have calls like this on a regular basis and that we all learn to treat the heat as the true health threat that it is. Thank you for your attention, and I wish you all the best of luck this summer.
Thank you, Dr. Kleinenberg. Very interesting closing remarks. On behalf of the Sub-IPC organizing panel for this webinar on building community preparedness to extreme heat, I would like to thank all of our panelists and Dr. Holdren for sharing their thoughts on this increasingly important topic. I would like to make it aware that the recorded webinar will be made available via link on a follow-up email, so please look out for that. I'd like to thank the audience for their attention and participation. So thanks again for joining today, and take care.